Okay, let's unpack this. We're seeing this huge push towards creating digital versions of real-world things, sometimes called digital
Yeah,
twins.
it's everywhere. Metaverse simulations.
Exactly. Think the metaverse, advanced simulations, even just, better product design. It's getting pretty sophisticated for simple objects like solid, rigid bodies.
Hmm.
But when you get to things that behave in really complex, dynamic ways like cloth, fluids, or gases, creating accurate digital replicas becomes, well, incredibly difficult.
It really does.
And specifically, trying to digitalize a particular real cloth sample, capturing its exact unique, subtle behavior for something like fashion design or animation that's been a major hurdle.
That's right. It's one thing to make a digital object that looks like cloth and moves kind of like cloth. It's another challenge entirely to take a swatch of that specific velvet or, that particular denim
Right.
and make a digital version that behaves physically, precisely like that piece of material would in the real world. The core problem is that cloth behavior is incredibly nuanced. It's influenced by so many factors: the material fibers, the weave or knit structure, its thickness, density.
Even environmental stuff.
Oh yeah, even environmental things like temperature and humidity.
Yeah.
So to get a truly accurate digital twin of a specific cloth,
Yeah.
you need really precise data about its physical properties and how it moves. And that kind of accurate data is surprisingly hard to come by.
Yeah, you can't just shoot a shaky phone video and expect to capture those tiny details and variations, right?
Not at all.
Traditional ways of doing this often involved hand-tuning parameters in a physics simulator until it looked about right.
Which is super tedious.
Super tedious, yeah, and still not perfect for a specific sample. And then data-driven deep learning methods, they can learn from examples, but they typically need absolutely massive data sets to be accurate.
Huge amounts of data.
And as we just said, getting precise cloth data on a large scale is tough. Even newer directions like differentiable physics, which are exciting, have struggled to replicate the exact behaviors of a given cloth sample because of this data problem.
Exactly. That's the gap.
So the mission for this deep dive is to explore a new method presented in the source material you shared that takes on this precise challenge head-on. They've developed a way to learn the specific physical characteristics of a cloth sample, not from tons of data, but from a very limited amount of very accurately measured information, using a novel approach they call Bayesian Differentiable Physics.
Yeah, BDP. And what really stands out to me here is their argument that one of the biggest roadblocks isn't necessarily the simulation technology itself,
Right.
but the quality and accuracy of the data you use to inform it. Cloth dynamics are so subtle, so easily affected by minor environmental changes, that controlled settings are essential for capture. They point out that textile standards have existed for a long time precisely to measure material properties rigorously, but these haven't often been leveraged in data collection for the kind of digital modeling needed for applications like fashion or animation.
So they looked at existing standards.
And this led them to focus on a specific, well-established standard, the Cusick drape test, following the British standard BSEN ISO 9073 9.2008.
Okay, let's break down the Cusick test because it sounds like it's central to their data.
It really is.
So imagine you have a circular piece of cloth, maybe about 30 centimeters across.
Yep, standard size.
You pin it at its exact center onto a smaller circular support, about 18 centimeters in diameter. The cloth is then just allowed to hang or drape under gravity.
Naturally.
And they do this in a strictly controlled environment, often a special black chamber, to eliminate distracting light and ensure consistent conditions.
Right, control is key.
Finally, a photo is taken from directly above, capturing the silhouette of the draped cloth against the support.
And that photo of the silhouette is the key piece of data. It effectively measures what textile scientists call drapability, how the fabric hangs and folds.
Okay.
It's a vision-based measurement, which is convenient, and it's been proven over many years in textile science to be effective for describing certain physical properties of a fabric.
But here's the catch with this Cusick data for most existing digital methods, right? It's incredibly limited information.
Very limited.
You typically get just one image per cloth sample. You don't get a full 3D scan of the drape's shape, and you definitely don't get video showing how it moved as it was draping.
No motion data, no full 3D geometry usually.
On top of that, real cloth materials are often heterogeneous, meaning the properties might not be perfectly uniform even within that single sample.
Yeah, think about a knit versus a woven fabric. Lots of local variation.
And the act of draping itself can involve a bit of randomness or stochasticity.
Right, drop it twice, it might not look exactly the same.
So existing methods, especially deterministic ones that expect uniform properties and loads of data, really struggle with this data scarcity, the heterogeneity, and the stochasticity.
They just aren't built for it. This is exactly where the paper's proposed new method, Bayesian Differentiable Physics, or BDP, comes in. It's specifically designed to tackle these limitations.
The core idea is quite clever, isn't it? Instead of trying to learn fixed physical parameters from tons of data.
Which we don't have.
Which we don't have, right? They infer a range of plausible parameters directly from that single limited Cusick drape image.
And the choice of a Bayesian approach is critical. It's what allows them to handle that data scarcity. Or effectively, they can learn meaningful information, even from limited samples.
Okay.
Crucially, it also lets them model that material heterogeneity and dynamic stochasticity we discussed.
Great.
Instead of trying to find one single perfect number for stiffness or density for the whole cloth, they learn distributions of plausible physical parameters across the material.
Distributions, so like a range of likely values.
Exactly. This distribution captures the expected variation and uncertainty. It's a more realistic way to think about real materials.
Okay, so how does this BDP actually work under the hood at a high level? What are the pieces?
You have two main parts working together. First, there's a differentiable cloth model. This is a physics simulation that understands how cloths should behave.
Okay, the physics part.
But it's built in a way that allows you to track how changes in its physical parameters, like stiffness density, would affect the final draped shape.
And the second part?
Second, there's a differentiable renderer. This takes the simulated 3D shape of the cloth from the physics model and predicts what its silhouette would look like from above.
Mimicking the Cusick test camera view.
Exactly. So you can directly compare the simulation's output to the real photo.
So differentiable physics is the key piece enabling this. What does that actually mean in this context? Sounds complex.
It sort of is, but think of it like being able to ask the simulation, if I made this material slightly stiffer, how much would that change the final silhouette? The differentiable part means the entire process, from the physical parameters through the simulation to the predicted image, is set up mathematically so they can calculate these sensitivities, or gradients.
Gradients, like in machine learning.
Exactly like that. This is incredibly powerful because it lets them use efficient gradient-based optimization methods, the same kind of techniques used to train deep neural networks like backpropagation,
right,
to automatically adjust the physical parameters until the simulated silhouette closely matches the real Cusick silhouette. It's how the system learns.
And their differentiable cloth model isn't just any model. You mentioned it's built specifically to handle the complexity of real cloth, the heterogeneity, and stochasticity.
Exactly. Most simulation models assume the material properties are uniform, homogeneous across the entire object. Their model is heterogeneous.
Meaning?
It can learn and represent material property variations across the digital mesh, representing the cloth sample, learning parameters for different local areas.
So different stiffness in different spots?
Potentially, yes. And because it's Bayesian, it's also stochastic. It incorporates randomness into these material parameters.
Okay, stochastic. Random.
Yeah, it means when they run the simulation, it can produce slightly different drape shapes each time, reflecting the natural variability you'd see if you repeatedly draped the same physical cloth sample. It captures that inherent fuzziness.
And the Bayesian inference is how they use that single image to figure out these varying parameters and their randomness. Seems like a lot to get from one picture.
It is, but that's the power of the Bayesian framework here. Using that single limited image, the model infers the posterior distribution of the cloth material parameters.
Posterior distribution. Fancy term.
Yeah. Basically, it learns the probability distribution of what the parameters could be, given the evidence in the image. They assume these parameters follow a Gaussian distribution, a standard bell curve shape.
Okay, familiar shape.
Which is a common way to represent uncertainty and variation. And to learn this distribution efficiently using gradient descent, they employ a technique called variational inference combined with the reparameterization trick.
Whoa, okay. Variational inference, reparameterization trick. Can you simplify that a bit?
Sure, let's try. Very simply, variational inference is a way to approximate a complex, true distribution, the perfect parameters we can't easily find, with a simpler, easier-to-learn distribution. like that Gaussian bell curve with a specific mean and variance.
So finding a good enough approximation.
Kind of, yeah. And the reparameterization trick is a clever mathematical tool that makes this approximation process compatible with gradient-based training. It lets you train the parameters of your approximate distribution, like the mean and spread of that bell curve, using those standard optimization methods we talked about.
Okay, so it makes the math work out for learning the distribution itself.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Sounds like a computationally intensive process, though.
It does. They mention implementing this in PyTorch C++ here, using GPU parallel computing and sparse matrices for efficiency.
Yeah, gotta make it run fast.
And leveraging a differentiable render package called Kalin. That's a serious technical undertaking.
Absolutely. And a key point they make, which we touched on, is that a major roadblock for data-driven methods in this space has been the sheer lack of suitable public data.
Right. Nobody has huge databases of these standardized tests.
Exactly. Collecting accurate standardized data like the Cusick drape test is time-consuming and labor-intensive. That's why you don't see massive public data sets of standardized cloth drape tests like you might for images of cats and dogs.
So they had to create their own data set. Makes sense.
Yes, and they did it properly, strictly following that British standard for Cusick drape testing we mentioned.
Good. Rigor matters here.
Totally. Their dataset includes 25 different types of common fabrics, carefully selected, and they collected multiple samples for each type.
Multiple samples are important for testing generalization, right?
Crucial. They provide the raw data, the Cusick silhouette images used for training, and reconstructed 3D meshes primarily used for evaluation, and they also measured basic physical properties like sample weight, area density, and thickness.
And they highlight that their dataset has advantages over other limited datasets out there.
Yes. More fabric types, more samples per type, and crucially, it provides both the raw measurement data and the estimated physical parameters they derived.
Ah, the distributions.
Represented as distributions,
Yeah.
And the fact that it rigorously follows established standards with controlled environments and measurements makes it much more accurate and reproducible than data collected casually, which is essential for learning subtle material properties.
Okay, so they have this new method, BDP, and their new carefully curated data set. What did the experiments actually show? Did it work?
They set up experiments using 5 representative cloth types from their dataset, specifically chosen because they showed distinct drapeability characteristics, different kinds of hangs and fold. For each cloth type, they had 12 samples. Critically, they trained their BDP model in just one single sample per cloth type.
Just one.
Just one, and then tested how well it can predict the drape shape for the other 11 unseen samples of that same cloth type. This tests the method's ability to generalize within a material type, capturing its inherent variability.
Okay, the real test. And the quantitative results. How did it perform against other approaches?
BDP significantly underperformed deterministic models. They compared against one assuming homogeneous material and one assuming heterogeneous material, but using a deterministic learning approach, HEATR.
Deterministic meaning they just find one set of parameters, not a distribution.
Exactly. BDP wasn't just better at fitting the single training sample, it was much, much better at generalizing to those unseen testing samples of the same cloth type.
How did they measure that?
They used metrics like mean squared error, MSE,
Yeah.
and Hausdorff distance, HDs. MSE is essentially the average square distance between corresponding points in the simulated and real drapes.
So lower is better.
Lower is much better. And HDIS measures the largest distance between any point on one shape and the closest point on the other, kind of the worst case shape mismatch.
Also want that to be low.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers they show, like an average MSE of about 3.8 times 10 to the minus 2, and HDIS around 2.2 times 10 to the minus 2 for BDP.
Which sounds pretty small.
They're quite small, indicating a very close match. And these numbers are substantially lower than the error rates for the deterministic models, which had much higher errors, especially on the test samples.
And visually, what does that mean? Could you actually see the accuracy difference?
Oh yeah, they show figures that are very compelling. The drape, simulated by BDP for the training sample, looks almost identical to the real photo.
Okay, fits the training data well.
But more impressively, when they use the learned model to simulate the other 11 testing samples of that same cloth type, the simulated drapes accurately predict the different subtle variations in drape shape seen in the real testing samples.
So it captures that within type variability.
It does. The deterministic models, in contrast, might fit the training sample okay, but they completely fail to capture that within type variation when predicting the testing samples. Their predicted drapes often look very different from the real ones for those other 11 samples.
Did the model accidentally overgeneralize? Like, could it still tell the difference between completely different types of cloth? Or did everything just look like an average drape?
Good question. They checked this too, using radius angle graphs, which are standard in textile science, for plotting and comparing drape shapes.
Okay.
They show that the drapes simulated by BDP for different cloth types, like a stiff wool versus a soft viscose, maintain their distinctive characteristic shapes on these graphs.
So a wool drape looked like wool, viscose looked like viscose.
Exactly. This confirms the model isn't just learning a drape shape, it's learning the specific, defining drapeability characteristics of that particular cloth type.
The ultimate goal here is often simulating garments, right? Not just small circles of cloth. How did the parameters learned from a small Cusick sample translate to something bigger like a skirt?
This is where the potential gets really clear. They demonstrate that parameters learned from a single 30-centimeter Cusick sample of a specific fabric can be successfully applied to simulate garments made from that material. They show examples of skirts.
Cool. And the simulations reflected the material properties you'd expect. Like, did a silk skirt simulation look different from a denim one?
Absolutely. A simulated skirt made with parameters learned from viscose white, which they note is a heavy, soft knit that drapes with small, numerous folds in the Cusick test.
Right.
Looked visually very different from a skirt simulated with parameters learned from wool red, which is a thicker, stiffer woven fabric that creates larger, more pronounced folds.
And how did that difference show up?
The simulated wool red skirt looked noticeably wider and had bigger, more defined folds as it moved in animation, precisely reflecting its stiffness compared to the softer viscose white, which hung more closely with smaller folds.
Okay, that's convincing. And remember you said the Bayesian approach captures within type variation and stochasticity. Did that show up in the garment simulations too?
Yes, that's another key demonstration, because BDP learns a distribution of parameters.
Not just one number.
Right. By sampling from that distribution, learned for a single cloth type, they could simulate multiple skirts from that same digitized material.
And they looked slightly different.
Exactly. These different simulations showed subtle variations in the drape and silhouette of the skirt, just like you'd expect from the natural heterogeneity, and slight randomness in how a real fabric would hang or move. It captures the character of the specific fabric, including its natural variability.
That's really neat. It sounds more realistic. What about efficiency? You mentioned BDP uses gradient descent. How did that compare to other ways of finding parameters?
Yeah, they compared their gradient-based optimization approach within BDP to derivative-free optimization methods like REMBO and HESPO, which are sometimes used in material science for parameter fitting when you can't easily calculate gradients. BDP's gradient-based method was significantly more effective at finding good parameters and achieved better results with far fewer optimization steps.
So faster convergence to a better solution.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Fewer simulation runs needed to find the right parameters.
Yeah.
They also noted that their specific implementation using PyTorch C++ and CUD was much faster than a baseline implementation they compared against. Speed matters for practical use.
Definitely. So it seems like the method is accurate, generalizes well within a type, handles variability, translates to garments, and is efficient.
That's the picture they paint. And beyond just creating digital replicas, the authors point out that the learned parameter distributions themselves, what they call the posterior space, offer deeper insights into the material properties.
What do you mean by that? Like, you can look at the numbers and understand the cloth better, physically.
Exactly. The average stiffness values they learned for different fabrics directly reflected qualitative observations. For instance, viscose white, that soft knit fabric.
Yeah.
It learned much lower stretching stiffness values compared to cotton pink, which is a stiff woven fabric that, predictably, learned much higher stretching stiffness.
So the learned physics parameters actually match what we know about the materials intuitively.
Right. And it gets more interesting when you look at the spread of the distribution, the standard deviation.
What does that tell you?
That tells you about the material heterogeneity and dynamic stochasticity we keep mentioning.
Ah, the variability.
Yeah. Viscose white, again, is a good example. Its loose knit pattern means there's more variation in how it behaves, depending on where you measure it or exactly how it falls.
Okay.
This was reflected in a higher standard deviation in its learned parameters compared to more uniform materials like the cotton pink.
So they're getting this detailed information about the variation within a material sample just from that single silhouette image. That's incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
And getting that level of detail about material heterogeneity and stochasticity from standard Cusick drape data like this is genuinely novel, according to the paper. It's usually just used for a single drape coefficient number.
Fascinating. They even hint at fascinating potential future applications based on analyzing these learned distributions, right?
They do. Like what?
They suggest you could potentially combine the learned distributions from many different fabric types into a larger model, maybe something like a Gaussian mixture model to represent the space of common fabrics.
Like a map of fabric properties?
Kind of, yeah. And how could that be useful?
Well, think quality control in textile manufacturing. If you test a new batch of fabric, you could digitalize it using this method and see if its learned parameters fall within the expected distribution for that fabric type.
So flag batches that are off-spec?
Exactly. Or you could use it to identify an unknown material. They show an example comparing a linen green sample and a weird paper-like material to their learned fabric types using a metric called KL divergence.
KL divergence measures how different distributions are.
Yep, measures similarity. The linen green sample's parameters were most similar to cotton blue among their tested types, small KL divergence, while the paper's parameters were predictably very dissimilar to all fabrics, large KL divergence.
So you could potentially say, this unknown sample is most like cotton, or this sample is really weird, not like our known fabrics.
Precisely. This demonstrates the potential for material identification or quality checking, although they acknowledge you'd need to learn many more fabric types for a comprehensive model, but the potential is there.
So to wrap up this deep dive, the key achievement presented in this source material is this new method, BDP. It seems accurate, efficient, and shows strong generalization for digitalizing specific real-world cloths from very limited, standardized data.
And it successfully tackles the major challenges of data scarcity, material heterogeneity, and dynamic stochasticity by learning distributions of physical parameters, not just single values.
This work has significant potential to really move the needle in fields like customized digital fashion, high-fidelity computer animation, maybe even textile manufacturing, and broader digitalization tasks where accurate material properties are critical.
Definitely feels like a step forward.
They do acknowledge limitations, of course.
Right.
It's not a simple plug-and-play black box deep learning method. It requires incorporating prior physics knowledge into the model structure.
Right, you need some domain expertise.
But they argue convincingly, I think, that this is a worthwhile trade-off when collecting the necessary, highly accurate, standardized data is so expensive and time-consuming. You leverage physics knowledge to make the most of limited data.
Makes sense. And they point to future work like modeling more complex dynamics, such as cloth buckling.
How cloth wrinkles and crumples under compression.
Exactly, and conducting more extensive validation by comparing their simulated garments with real garments using motion capture data, seeing how well the animated skirt matches a real one.
That would be the ultimate test. So here's something for you, the listener, to consider based on this deep dive. How might the ability to capture and simulate not just the general behavior of a material, but the tiny variations and inconsistencies within a single sample, how might that potentially lead us beyond just creating better virtual clothes?
Interesting question.
Could this level of understanding inform how textiles are manufactured in the real world, perhaps leading to new quality control techniques, or maybe even inspire the creation of entirely novel synthetic materials with precisely designed and controlled or even intentionally variable properties? Something to think about.